She was 54 years old, and the only thing left in her name was a storage locker. She couldn't afford to keep past the end of the month. Not a house, not a car, not a savings account with anything in it worth counting. 31 years of marriage had ended on a Wednesday afternoon in March, with a single envelope slid under the door of the motel room she'd been renting by the week. A legal envelope. The kind that doesn't need a return address to tell you everything you need to know before you open it. Inside was a petition for divorce, already filed, already stamped, already moving through the system the way a stone rolls downhill once someone has let go of it. Bridget Calloway stood in the doorway of room 12 at the Lakeview Inn in Sudbury, Ontario, holding the envelope with both hands, and the funny thing, the thing she would remember for the rest of her life, was that the first feeling she had was not grief but relief. And then the grief came right behind it, and the relief went away, and what was left underneath both of them was a cold and total quiet she had never felt before. Like the lake in January when the ice has taken everything over and nothing moves and the whole world goes still. Her husband's name was Reed. Reed Calloway had been a contractor, good with his hands, good with numbers, not so good with the in-between things. The patience it takes to sit with a person through their sadness, the particular kind of presence that holds a marriage together when the walls stop being interesting to talk about. He had met a woman of 39 named Cassidy at a job site outside Barrie. Bridget had known about it for 8 months before he did anything about it, which is its own kind of cruelty, the knowing and the waiting and the watching a man rehearse his exit while you cook his suppers and wash his work shirts and keep the life running smooth because that is what you have always done and you don't know how to stop even when you know it's already over. The house was in both their names, which should have meant something. But Reed had a lawyer, and Bridget had 31 years of trusting that it would all be fair in the end, because she had been fair her whole life, and she had believed in the way only people who have never needed a lawyer truly believe, that fairness was something the world kept track of. It did not keep track. The settlement gave Reed the equity. It gave Bridget 18 months of temporary support and the understanding that she was to be grateful for it. She had $312 in her account the morning she got the envelope. She was a bookkeeper. She had done the books for Reed's contracting company for 22 years, without a paycheck. It was their business. They had agreed. It was the same as a paycheck. And so she had no employment record that meant anything to any new employer who looked at her resume, and she was 54 years old, which in the bookkeeping world is not a selling point. She applied for 12 jobs in 6 weeks. 2 of them called her back. Neither of them hired her. And all of this, every single cold and heavy piece of it, she was still carrying the morning the letter arrived from a law office in Kenora. Before we go any further, if you love stories like this one, take 1 second right now and hit subscribe. We put everything we have into these quiet, honest stories, and we make them for the people who sit all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments where in Canada you're listening from. We want to know. Now let's get back to Bridget. The letter from the law office in Kenora was brief. Her father, Emile Sauvé, had died of a stroke at the age of 78, alone in a fishing camp on the Winnipeg River that he had owned and operated, or rather, had occupied and kept from falling over, for the past 27 years. He had left the property to his only child, Bridget. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the scratchy motel bedspread and looked at the water stain on the ceiling tile above the bed, and felt the particular numbness that comes when one more impossible thing happens after you have already used up your capacity for surprise. Her father. Emile Sauvé was a man she had not spoken to in 14 years, not because of a single dramatic rupture, but because of the slow, quiet way 2 people who do not know how to reach each other eventually stop trying. He had been a trapper and a fishing guide in the bush country north of Kenora for as long as Bridget could remember. A French-Canadian man from a small town on the Quebec border, who had married her mother, an Anglophone woman from Sudbury named Carol, in a fit of romantic optimism that lasted 11 years before it didn't. When the marriage ended, Emile had gone back to the bush. Bridget was 13. Her mother raised her, and her mother did not speak ill of Emile exactly, but she spoke around him the way you speak around a piece of furniture someone has moved. You adjust your path without saying why. Bridget had seen her father perhaps a dozen times in her adult life. He came to her wedding. He sent cards at Christmas. He called sometimes on her birthday, and the calls were awkward in the way of 2 people who love each other, but have never developed the language for it. He had met Reed twice and had said nothing about him either time, which Bridget had interpreted as approval, and which she now understood was simply her father being her father, a man who understood that words given carelessly do more harm than no words at all. She had not gone to the funeral. There had been no funeral. Emil had left instructions with the law office that he was to be cremated, and his ashes scattered on the river without ceremony, because he had never been a man for ceremony, and he saw no reason to start at 78. She called the law office. A man named Remy Blondeau, who had the patient, unhurried voice of someone who has handled a great many things that other people find overwhelming, explained the situation. The fishing camp was called Camp Sauve. It sat on a point of land above the Winnipeg River, 40 minutes by road from Kenora, 12 acres of Canadian Shield, 3 cabins, a boathouse, a bait shed, and a main lodge that had been built in 1961 and had not been significantly updated since. The property had been assessed by the municipality. The assessed value, Remy Blondeau said, was $4,000. $4,000 for 12 acres on the Winnipeg River, Bridget repeated, because she was a bookkeeper, and numbers were the one thing she never let slide past without examining them. That's correct, he said. The lodge roof is compromised. 2 of the 3 cabins have structural issues. There's no current operating license for the camp. The dock is condemned. The municipality has been carrying a tax lien on the property for 6 years. After the lien, the assessed value is effectively 0. He paused. You can come and claim it and assume the tax debt, or you can decline it and let the municipality take possession. Bridget sat on the edge of the motel bed. She thought about $312. She thought about the storage locker and the 12 job applications and the woman of 39 named Cassidy. She thought about her father, who had lived alone in a condemned fishing camp for 27 years with a tax lien and a bad roof, and had apparently seen fit to leave it to her rather than fix any of it. She thought about a morning when she was 9 years old, when her father had taken her out in his old aluminum canoe at dawn, on a lake that she no longer remembered the name of, and they had sat without moving for an hour in the mist while the loons called back and forth across the water. He had not said anything for most of that hour. Then he had said in his accented English that always made ordinary things sound deliberate. Some things take a long time to show you what they are. You have to sit with them. She had not thought about that morning in 30 years. She did not know she still had it until it came back to her there on the edge of the bed, in room 12 of the Lakeview Inn, whole and clear like something that had been kept somewhere safe without her knowing. She called Remy Blondeau back the next morning. She told him she was coming. It took 2 days on the bus, Sudbury to Sault Ste. Marie, then north and west, the Canadian Shield rolling by the window in the way it does, lake and rock and black spruce and lake again, the sky getting bigger and emptier with every hour, the towns getting smaller and further apart until there were almost no towns at all. Bridget watched it through the glass with a feeling she couldn't quite name, like she was traveling backwards into something instead of forward. Remy Blondeau met her at the bus station in Kenora, in a sensible gray Subaru. He was a small man in his 60s with a white mustache and the look of someone who had spent his career being the calm person in rooms full of people who were not calm. He drove her out of town on a highway that became a county road that became a gravel the trees until it ended at a rusted gate, with a hand-painted sign wired to it, Camp Sauve, Est 1961. The paint had gone the color of old bone. He unlocked the gate and drove through, and the camp came into view through the trees. Bridget looked at it for a long time through the windshield and said nothing. The main lodge was a long, low building of squared logs, its roof sagging in the middle where the rafters had given way under too many winters of snow. The 3 cabins were arranged behind it along the point, 2 of them visibly tilting. The boathouse had lost most of one wall. The dock sat crooked in the gray river, half its planks missing or rotten. Everything was the color of weather and time. Silver gray wood, rusted hardware, shingles gone green with moss on the north sides, and yet, the point of land itself was extraordinary. It thrust out into the Winnipeg River at a place where the river was wide and slow, and the far shore was a wall of dark spruce going up into a sky that was, on this October afternoon, the specific blue that seems to exist only in northwestern Ontario in the fall. The water moved past the point with a sound like something breathing slowly. A pair of mergansers floated in the eddy below the old dock. The birch trees along the shore had gone gold and were letting go of their leaves one at a time, each one dropping straight down onto the still water and floating there like small yellow lights. You have to sit with them, her father had said. Remy Blondeau handed her a ring of keys and told her he'd come back in the morning. He asked if she needed anything, and when she said no, he nodded in the way of a man who has learned to trust people to mean what they say, and his Subaru went back up through the trees, and the gate clicked shut behind it. And Bridget was alone on the point with the river and the birches and the ruined camp that was worth, on paper, nothing at all. She stood there for a while, just looking. The wind moved through the birches, and the golden leaves came down in slow spirals and landed on the river and were carried away. Somewhere on the water, a loon called, just once. And the sound of it crossed the river and came back off the far shore, and Bridget felt it in her sternum the way a loon soul. When you've been away from the north for a long time, a feeling like being reminded of something you didn't know you'd forgotten. She walked to the lodge. There was a hand-lettered sign above the door, the same faded white paint, 3 words, "Come in, open." She put the key in the lock. It was stiff, but it turned. Inside was a single long room with exposed log walls and a plank floor worn almost white. A stone fireplace stood at one end cold, its hearth swept clean. A long wooden counter ran along one wall, its surface gone gray and smooth. Behind the counter, mounted on the log wall, was a wooden board with hooks. 12 hooks, each one numbered, each one still holding a key on a leather fob, except for hook 9. Hook 9 was empty. There were 3 mismatched chairs near the fireplace, an oil lamp on the counter, its wick trimmed. A tin coffee percolator on the wood stove in the corner, the small kind that sits on a burner, not the kind you plug in. A cast iron pot. On the shelf above the stove, a row of canned goods lined up neat. Beans, soup, salmon, and beside them a jam jar full of saved rubber bands and twist ties and small nails. The kind of jar a person keeps because they were raised to waste nothing. The sight of that jar stopped Bridget where she stood. Her father had kept the same kind of jar on the shelf above the kitchen sink in every place she had ever visited him. Rubber bands and saved twist ties and small bent nails. Because you never know. Because something that cost you nothing might one day cost someone else everything. She touched the jar with the tips of her fingers and did not speak. The lodge smelled of wood smoke and river water and old paper, and underneath all of it, very faint, coffee. Not fresh coffee. The ghost of 27 years of coffee, soaked into the log walls until the building itself smelled like warmth, like someone had kept something going in here for a very long time, and had only just stepped out. She walked the length of the counter, running her hand along the smooth edge. She looked at the keyboard. 11 keys, 1 missing, hook 9. All 3 of the cabins outside were equally abandoned. So why was the key to cabin 9 not on the board? She was still looking at that empty hook when she heard the sound on the porch, a soft weight settling. She turned. In the doorway, sitting absolutely still, was a cat, very old. Orange and white, its muzzle gone pale, one ear notched from some ancient argument. It looked at her with the calm, unhurried assessment of an animal that has been resident somewhere for a long time, and is prepared to evaluate newcomers at its own pace. On its collar was a small metal tag. Bridget crouched down and held her hand out, and after a moment the cat stepped forward and pressed its forehead briefly against her knuckles. She turned the tag to the light from the window. 9. She sat down on the plank floor right there, her back against the counter, and the cat walked into her lap with the certainty of an animal that has made this decision and does not expect to be questioned about it. And Bridget put her hands on its warm back and felt, for the first time since the envelope had come under the door of room 12, that she was not entirely alone. If this story is reaching you, take 1 second and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, who is the person in your life you misunderstood for years before you finally learned the truth? We read every single one. Now back to Bridget. The cat had been fed recently. The bowl under the counter was clean and there was kibble in it, placed there within the last day or 2 by someone who was not Emile, because Emile had been dead for 3 weeks. Someone was still coming to the camp. Someone was still feeding the cat named 9. She met that someone the next morning. She was sweeping the lodge porch at first light when she heard the creak of the gate and looked up to see a woman coming down the track through the trees on foot, carrying a canvas bag in each hand. She was perhaps 70, with gray hair braided back and a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, and she moved through the trees with the comfortable ease of someone who knows every root and stone of a path they have walked 1,000 times. She stopped when she saw Bridget. They looked at each other. "You'd be Emile's girl," the woman said. "Not a question." "I would," Bridget said. The woman set her bags down and held out a hand. "Claudine Bergeron." I live the next point over, about a kilometer through the trees. I've been coming every few days to feed the cat and make sure the propane's not leaking." She looked at the lodge the way you look at a person you've known a long time. I was his nearest neighbor for 22 years. She came inside and made coffee on the tin percolator and sat down across from Bridget at the long table, and they talked the way two strangers talk when they have one large thing in common, and they're both still figuring out what to do with it. Claudine told her things about her father that Bridget had not known. He had risen early every morning, year-round, and had canoed the river before breakfast. He had maintained a trail through the bush between his point and hers, and he had cleared it every spring without being asked. In the winters when the road drifted in, he had snowshoed to the highway to check on her propane delivery. He had been the kind of neighbor who did the thing before you knew you needed it, and was gone before you could thank him. Quiet man, Claudine said, but not a distant one, if that makes sense. Present in the way that some very quiet people are. You always knew he was paying attention. Bridget thought about the phone calls on her birthday, the awkward silences. She thought about how she had always interpreted his quietness as a kind of absence. "He talked about you," Claudine said. Bridget looked up. "Not often, but when he did," Claudine wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "You could tell it was the thing that mattered most to him. He said once that he hoped you knew he was keeping watch, even from far off, that he'd never once stopped." She paused. "I don't know if that reaches you the way he meant it, but I thought you should know he said it." That was the moment the first crack appeared. Not in the story Bridget had carried about her father, but in the stone she had built around the part of herself that had missed him. And through the crack came something thin and cold and hard, like the first light through ice, and she was not ready for it, and she let it come anyway. She stayed. It was not a decision she made all at once. It was the kind of decision that makes itself, one morning at a time. She swept the lodge floor until the old planks showed clean. She dragged dead branches off the porch roof. She lit the wood stove in the evenings and let the warmth come back into the walls. She learned the wood stove's moods, the way it burned slow, and even with the damper at half, the smell it made when the chimney needed clearing. She learned which window stuck in the damp and which door had been planed down on the wrong side and caught in the frame if you didn't lift as you pulled. She found the propane still worked in the small kitchen behind the counter. She found a case of basic provisions in the back room: flour, oats, dried beans, and she cooked simple things on the old stove and ate them at the long table, watching the river go by through the window. And it was the first time in longer than she could remember that she had eaten a meal without accounting for someone else. On the fourth day, she was cleaning behind the keyboard, dusting the log wall with a rag, the way she had always cleaned, methodically, one small section at a time. When the board shifted under her hand, she looked. It was not nailed flat to the wall. It was hinged on one side and it swung inward. Behind it was a recess cut into the log, about the size of a shoebox. Inside was a canvas document envelope, the old-fashioned kind with a button and string closure, and a tin box about the size of a recipe card box, its lid pressed shut. Her heart moved slowly and heavily in her chest. She carried both to the table by the window where the light was strongest. She opened the document envelope first. "Wait, before I tell you what Bridget found inside that envelope. If this story has meant something to you, subscribe now and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Across Canada. It's the people who listen to the end who make these stories possible." Now back to Bridget and what her father left behind that wall. Inside the envelope was a ledger, not the accounting kind, not the kind Bridget knew from 22 years of doing the books. This was a cloth-bound notebook, the pages soft from handling, the cover stained with river water along one edge. Emil's handwriting on the first page was careful and deliberate, the writing of a man who had learned his letters in French and wrote English with great attention. Camp Sauvé, record of Cabin 9. Below that in smaller letters, Cabin 9 carries no charge, it is for the one who needs it. She turned the page. What she found was not a financial record. It was a list of people, date after date, name or description, one short line about the circumstance. All of them in the same slow, careful hand. Bridget read, and the further she read, the more her hands began to shake. October 1997. A man traveling east with nothing left in Winnipeg. Stayed 5 nights in 9. Helped split wood to pay. Sent on with food for the road. March 1999. A woman and her daughter. Car off the road in the snow. No way to reach anyone. Lodge had power that night. Stayed 3 days. She never said what she was running from, and she didn't have to. July 2001. A young couple with a canoe and a plan that hadn't worked and no money to get home stayed a week. He fixed the boathouse door. She painted the signs. Neither of them had to. She turned pages and the list went on, entry after entry, across more than 2 decades. A First Nations man in his 50s who had been walking the highway and had not eaten since the day before, written as, "Good man, tired, needed to be let to sleep." A teenager from the city on a bike with everything he owned in a dry bag, gone thin and sunburned and nearly out of road. A family of 4 from somewhere east of Thunder Bay whose truck had broken down at the gate, and who had stayed 6 days while the part came in from Winnipeg, eating at the long table. Every night, their 2 kids fishing off the old dock and bringing up perch. An elderly man who gave no name, who stayed 2 weeks in November and is recorded only as didn't sleep much, was here when he needed to be, and scattered through the entries, in a different ink, the ink of someone returning to a record years later to update it, were lines that made Bridget have to stop and put the notebook down, and look at the river for a while before she could go on. The woman from March '99 wrote 8 years later. She is a social worker now in Portage la Prairie. She said to say thank you for the 3 days. She has paid it forward 40 times, she said. The boy on the bike sent a photograph. He is in Vancouver. He has a shop. He left the porch light on for the first year to remember. The family with the 2 kids. The older one is studying to be a mechanic. She wrote to say that when they were stuck at the gate with the broken truck, her father had believed it was the end. She said cabin 9 made him believe again. I wrote back that it was his children who did that, but I understand what she meant. And between the entries, in short lines written like notes to himself, reminders or prayers or both, keep 9 ready. Someone is always one bad night from needing a door. The river doesn't turn anyone away. 9 stays open. The phrase came back again and again, page after page, 27 years of it. 9 stays open. In the same slow hand, winter and summer, the bush around him and the river below him and the door of cabin 9, never locked, never charged, never closed. Bridget closed the notebook. She opened the tin box. Inside were letters, postcards, notes on folded paper, a few photographs, all addressed to Émile Sauvé, Camp Sauvé, or simply, the man at the camp on the river. She took them out one by one. She read them all. And then she found, at the very bottom of the tin box, a small envelope of its own, sealed with her name written on the outside in her father's hand. Not Bridget Calloway, her married name. Her birth name, Bridget Sauvé. She had not been called that since she was 13 years old. She opened the envelope. Bridget, my girl, I know you grew up thinking I chose the bush over you. I want you to know that is not what happened, even if I understand why it looked that way. Your mother needed a life I did not know how to give her, and she needed to build something new, and I thought the kindest thing I could do was to stay out of the way and let her do it. I was wrong about that. I have had a long time out here to understand how wrong I was. A quiet man can believe his silence is a gift when it is only an absence, and the two are not the same thing. I sent money every year through the church to your mother, for your schooling, and I asked her not to say where it came from, because she asked that of me and I kept my word. I watched you from a distance the way you watch a river from the bank, never in it but never looking away. I bought this camp because it was falling down and nobody wanted it, and I understood falling down things. I kept cabin 9 open for the same reason. You spend enough winters alone on the shield. You understand that a single light in the dark is not a small thing. It is sometimes the only thing. The ledger is a record of everyone who came through that door. The tin holds the words they sent back. I leave both to you. I am not leaving you a going concern. The camp is in poor shape and I am sorry for that. But the land is real and the river is real, and you are your father's daughter, which means you know how to sit with a thing until it shows you what it is. There is something else you should know, and Rémi Blondeau can explain the legal parts better than I can. But I did not spend 27 years out here without making sure that what I was keeping would be kept after I was gone. 9 stays open. If you can, keep it open. Your father, Émile. Bridget set the letter down on the table. The river moved past the point in the October light, gold and gray. The cat named 9 was asleep in the chair by the cold fireplace. Claudine had gone home an hour ago and the camp was very quiet, and the quiet felt, for the first time, like something her father had arranged for her. She did not cry immediately. She sat with it the way he had told her to sit with things. And then she did cry, quietly for a long time, not from grief, or not only from grief, but from the particular relief of understanding. At last, a thing you have carried in the wrong way for 40 years. She had carried her father's absence as proof that she was not worth staying for. She understood now that it had been a different kind of keeping. The wrong kind, maybe. The kind that costs everyone, but keeping all the same. In the morning she went to see Remy Blondeau in Kenora. She brought the letter and the notebook and the tin box and set them on his desk, and asked him to tell her what her father had meant about arrangements. Remy Blondeau put his glasses on and read the letter carefully. When he looked up, his eyes were not dry. "I've been Emil's solicitor for 19 years, he said. "I knew he was a good man. I didn't know he was good like this." He opened the file. "In 2011, he said, your father came to this office. He was past 60, and he'd started thinking about what would happen to the camp after him. He knew that without protection, the land would either be seized for the tax debt or sold for development. He had seen what had been happening to river properties in the region. Recreational buyers, cottages, waterfront development. He didn't want that. He turned a page. The first thing he did was register a conservation covenant on the land through the province. You know what that is?" Bridget shook her head. "It is a legally binding restriction that runs with the land permanently. It says that this property may only be used for low-impact purposes consistent with its character as a wilderness camp. No subdivision, no commercial resort development, no clear-cutting. Any future owner, including you, must comply with it. Anyone who buys the land from you must comply with it. It cannot be removed short of a court order for which the grounds would be extremely narrow." Bridget was quiet for a moment. "The tax lien," she said, "that is the other thing." Remy Blondeau almost smiled. "The assessed value of the land is $4,000 after the lien. That is the municipal assessment. What the municipality did not assess, because it is assessed separately and your father kept it very quiet, is the water lot. In 1998, the province issued your father a water lot license for the point. It gives him now registered use of the riverbed and a portion of the river surface in front of the property. In the current market, with recreational river properties being what they are in northwestern Ontario, the licensed water lot alone is worth considerably more than anyone has offered your father for the land." Bridget looked at him. "There is a development company out of Winnipeg," he said, "that has been making inquiries about properties on this stretch of the Winnipeg River for the past 2 years. They have been in contact with the municipality about the tax lien. They were expecting to acquire this property through the tax process for very little. The conservation covenant stops them from developing it. The water lot license complicates their access to the river for any adjacent development. Your father knew exactly what he was doing when he filed both documents 13 years ago." He paused. "He also established a trust. He called it the Save River Trust. He put aside what he could over 20 years from guiding fees, from the other cabins when he rented them, from whatever the land could give him. The trust is meant to cover the tax arrears and maintain the property. As of today, the trust holds $94,000. Bridget sat in the chair across from Remy Blondeau's desk for a long moment. She was a bookkeeper. She understood numbers. She understood what 20 years of setting aside guiding fees, a few hundred at a time, in a trust for a daughter you had not spoken to in years, actually meant in terms of intention and discipline, and a particular kind of love that does not ask to be seen. She understood that her father, who had lived alone in a camp on the Canadian Shield, with a condemned dock and a leaking roof and a tax lien, had quietly protected this land, and the trust that went with it, from everyone including the well-funded company that had been circling it. Not for himself, but for a future he would not be in. She drove back out to the camp that afternoon. Remy had told her a man from the development company had already called twice about scheduling a meeting. She did not return the call. 3 days later, the man came in person. He arrived in a black pickup truck with Manitoba plates and a company logo on the door, and he was younger than she expected, maybe 45. With a kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who had better information. He introduced himself as Darnell Ash, acquisitions manager, and he shook her hand with a grip that was practiced and held half a beat too long. He looked around the camp with an expression he was trying to keep neutral and failing slightly. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I appreciate you taking the time. I'll be straightforward with you. This property has been on a difficult road. The tax situation, the structural issues, it's a real burden for someone in your position, and I think we both know that turning this around would require significant capital investment you may not have access to." His smile was easy and sorry at the same time. Our company is prepared to offer you $42,000 for the land. That clears the tax debt and leaves you with a meaningful amount of money to start fresh. Given where things stand, I think you'll find that's a fair number." Bridget looked at him for a moment. "What is it you want to build here?" she asked. "River access development," he said. "Recreational infrastructure. This is a beautiful stretch of water. The property carries a conservation covenant," Bridget said, "filed in 2011. You can't build recreational infrastructure here. You can't subdivide. You can't clear the point." She watched his face. "I'm also told you've been interested in river access for adjacent properties you're looking at. The water lot license complicates that, which is why you're here." Darnell Ash's easy smile held, but something shifted behind it, the way a lake's surface shifts when something moves underneath. "Mrs. Calloway, these documents can be complex. I was a bookkeeper for 22 years, Bridget said. "I understand complex documents." She was sitting in the chair by the window of the lodge, her father's notebook open on the table in front of her. The cat named Nine was on the counter behind her. Claudine was in the kitchen, because she had asked Claudine to come, and Claudine had come without asking why. 2 women and an elderly cat. 3 things the world had undervalued and handed back. "The camp is not for sale," Bridget said. "The water lot is not for sale. The covenant is not negotiable. I appreciate you making the drive, and I'm going to ask you to have a good trip back to Winnipeg." Darnell Ash looked at her. Then he looked at the notebook. Then at the cat. Then at Claudine in the kitchen doorway with a mug of coffee, and the unhurried look of a woman who has nothing to prove and nowhere to be. He understood that he had come to the wrong place. He had come with the assumption that a woman who had arrived with nothing would leave with anything, and the thing he had not been able to account for, the thing that was not in any assessment or survey or municipal file, was 27 years of slow and quiet love built into the walls of a lodge on a river point, documented in a cloth-bound notebook, and protected by a man who had understood exactly what people like Darnell Ash would one day try to do. He left. The sound of the Manitoba truck faded up the gravel track and was gone, and the river went back to its own sound, and the birches let go of a few more gold leaves, and the cat named Nine jumped down from the counter and went to sit in a square of afternoon sun on the plank floor. Bridget Sauvé, she had gone back to it, quietly without announcement, just changed the name in her own mind like opening a window, stayed at Camp Sauvé. She used the trust carefully, the way her father had used everything, with the understanding that the money was not hers in any simple sense, but held in service of a purpose she had inherited, along with the property. She paid the tax arrears. She hired a local carpenter from Kenora to assess the lodge roof, and she worked alongside him for 2 weeks, and at the end of it the lodge was sound. She fixed the dock herself, plank by plank, Claudine handing her boards and holding the level while Nine patrolled the dock perimeter, with professional concern for every nail that hit the water. Cabin 9 she fixed last and most carefully. New window, sound door, clean bed, oil lamp filled. A split of birch wood ready in the small stove. She swept the floor and aired the mattress, and made the bed up with white sheets and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room that her father had kept ready for 27 years. For people he had not yet met, she did not lock the door. She had understood by then that the door of cabin 9 was never locked. That was the entire point of it. She found Father's old wood burning set in the bait shed, and she made a small sign for the cabin door, the way her father had once made signs for everything that needed naming. She burned 3 words into a piece of cedar, slow and careful, the way he would have done it. Open. Always open. She rehung it on the nail where the old sign had been. And then things began to happen the way they happen when a light comes back on in a place that has been dark. The first person to come through the camp after Bridget arrived was an old man named Seraphan, who had fished this river with Emile for 30 years, and who arrived one afternoon with a bottle of Crown Royal, and the need to sit with someone who would understand why the camp being kept was important. He stayed for supper, and told Bridget stories about her father that she had never heard and could not have heard, and she listened the way her father had listened, without interruption, paying attention, and understood, as she listened, that this was also something she had inherited. Then came a woman in her late 30s named Tasha, who had driven up from the city with 2 kids in the back seat, and an expression that Bridget recognized from the inside, the particular look of someone who has gotten as far as they can get and needs to not have to explain it. Bridget did not ask her to explain. She made up cabin 9, which was ready, which was always ready, and she fed the kids soup at the long table and let Tasha sleep a full night uninterrupted, for what turned out to be the first time in weeks. In the morning, Tasha sat at the table with coffee and told Bridget, without being asked, a little of what she was running from. And Bridget wrote down a number in Kenora and a name and said, "This person can help," and gave her enough gas money to get there, and watched the car go down the track through the trees until it was gone. That night she opened her father's ledger to the first blank page after his last entry. She picked up a pen. She had her father's deliberate hand, she realized. She had not known this about herself. She wrote slowly, November, a woman and 2 children traveling, stayed in 9, no charge, sent on with what they needed. Below that, where her father's name had been in each entry, she wrote her own, Be Sauvé. And then below that, in the same slow hand, she wrote her father's line. 9 stays open. She closed the ledger and held it for a moment, the way you hold something that has weight beyond its actual weight. Then she opened the hinged board on the wall and slid the ledger back into the recess, where it sat against the log in the dark the way a kept thing sits. Patient, known, held. She walked out onto the porch. The river was black in the October night, and the stars over the Canadian shield were the particular stars of the north, dense and cold and astonishing. The same stars her father had once pointed out to her from a canoe when she was 9 years old, and had not understood yet that the stars are one of the things that don't leave. Across the water, visible on the far shore, there was nothing. No light, no road, just the dark mass of the spruce forest going north for 100 kilometers without stopping. And behind her, above the door of the lodge, the single bulb her father had wired in, sometime in the 90s, threw its light out across the gravel clearing and across the dock, and across the first few yards of the dark river. Not far, not bright, but visible from the water, which was all it had ever needed to be. Visible from the water, for anyone coming in at night who needed to know there was a place. She had found at the bottom of everything, at 54 years old with $312, and a storage locker and a marriage that had used her up and handed her back. The one place on earth where the bottom was not the end but the floor. The place that had been held open for her, quietly, across a distance, by a man who had believed in her continuance even when she hadn't. She thought about Reed, who had counted money as the measure of a thing, and had found the camp worth nothing. She thought about Darnell Ash, who had driven all the way from Winnipeg to buy what he believed could not say no. She thought about her mother, who had turned her father into a story of absence because the alternative, the truth of what he was, and what he was doing, and how much it had cost to keep doing it in silence, would have been too complicated to live beside. She understood that all of them had been afraid, in their different ways, and that fear had made them close things down, count things out, take what they could carry and leave the rest. Her father had been afraid too. She had no doubt about that. A man alone on the shield for 27 winters, turning 60, turning 70, watching his body slow, and his roof leak and the tax lien grow. Keeping a light on for strangers and a notebook of names and a tin box of thank you notes from people who had passed through and never looked back. That man had plenty to be afraid of, but he had kept the door open anyway. Every night, every winter, every year. That was the whole of it. That was the thing the ledger said on every page in different names and dates and circumstances. Not the absence of fear, but the decision made while still afraid, quietly, with no one watching, on the loneliest point of land on the Winnipeg River. She came inside. She filled the percolator and put it on the burner and listened to it begin to work. She sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the river, at the dark, at her own single light reflected on the water. The cat named 9 came and settled into her lap, warm and heavy, and sighed the long sigh of an old animal that has decided it is home. And Bridget Sauvé kept the door open between them, the woman and the old cat, the way it had always been kept, the way her father had always meant for it to be kept, and the way she now understood it would be kept, after her, by whoever came to the point next, and found the ledger behind the board and the letter in the tin box and the door of cabin 9 standing open always, for the next one who needed it. That is what a father leaves when he has nothing to leave. Not the land, not the money, not the walls or the water or the winterproof roof. He leaves the understanding that a door held open is a door held open forever, that every person who passes through it carries it forward, and that this is the only inheritance that compounds. Keep 9 open.